Hi, I'm Adam Summer. You're listening to the Yerushalmi Talk podcast with the support of the Yeshivat Devar Yerushalayim in Har Nof, Jerusalem. This is Sheviis, chapter 1, Halacha 2. Yesterday, we were covering the scriptural passage in Leviticus 25, 1 through 7. And in there, where it's saying, Hashem spoke to Moses on Mount Sinai, saying, "Speak to the children of Israel and say to them, when you come to the land that I'm giving you, the land shall observe a Shabbos rest to Hashem. 6 years you may sow your field, 6 years you may prune your vineyard, and you may gather in the produce. But in the 7th year shall be a complete rest for the land. To Hashem, your field you shall not sow, your vineyard you shall not prune." Well, what is missing there? Well, plowing is missing there. That is not specifically mentioned there. And also what's not mentioned there is any time before the 7th year. Now, we were covering this yesterday, and it brings up a big question. What's the big question? Why is it that Rebbe organized chapter 1 to be talking about fields of trees, and chapter 2 in Sheviis is talking about fields of grain? Fields of grain are more common than fields of trees. Nonetheless, in the organization, Rebbe says, no, we have to be talking about field of trees first. Why? And we have an answer that we've been discovering yesterday on why that is, and here's how it goes. So in there, that thing that I just read you, plowing is not there. And as you see, the work that's prohibited beforehand is not done. And as we discovered in Halacha 1, that was the work that was before the Sheviis year, that was instituted by Bet Hillel and Bet Shammai. There was no disagreement on that. And so what was the cutoff? The cutoff was for fields of grain, it would be on the last day of Pesach, after Pesach, and on trees, it would be Shavuot. And there was a hard deadline by Bet Hillel on Shavuot, but as we saw in the Mishnah, the difference between Bet Shammai and Bet Hillel is very, very slight, and it's basically about the same time in most years. So why is that? What does this mean? So in the case of the plowing, why is it going to be later for the field of trees? Because the plowing that comes before, which was instituted as a prohibition from Bet Shammai and Bet Hillel, but later repealed by a later court. It was later repealed by the court of Rabban Gamliel. Why was it repealed? That's going to be coming up, but the point is, it was repealed, and this is still preserving this in case they want to go back to it at a later date. They're allowed to. This was put in by the courts of Bet Hillel and Bet Shammai. So the idea is that the plowing that happens for the field of grain after Pesach, that's not for the value and worth of this year's produce anymore. It's for next year's produce, and that puts it into the Sheviis year, into the 7th year. So that if you're doing the work now, you're really doing it to improve the ground for next year's harvest. That's a problem. And if you're doing it for plowing for a field of trees up to Shavuot, well, all you're doing is improving the quality of the fruit for the 6th year. And that is why chapter 1 is going to be about fields of trees, because this is the one action, the plowing, that's not specifically mentioned in the verse. It's mentioned elsewhere. And what is talked about is going to be this this law that was instituted d'Rabbanan by Bet Hillel, Bet Shammai. And why this has to be with the trees first is because this work of plowing, this is still benefiting this year's fruit. It's not benefiting next year's fruit. Only if you're doing it after Shavuot are you going to be benefiting next year's fruit. And that is why chapter 1 is talking about fields of trees, because while you're plowing the ground before Sheviis, after Pesach, but before Sheviis or up to the day of Sheviis, well, you're still benefiting this year's fruit. You're not doing anything for preparation for the next year's crop. And that's why this has to be talked about first, because we have to cover that so that people know that uh, you're allowed to do it, and you're not doing anything that violates what was instituted by Bet Hillel and Bet Shammai, and that's why, because it's benefiting this year's fruit, not next year's fruit, not next year's crop. The Mishnah in Halacha 2 is going to be dealing with plowing a field of trees before the Sheviis year, the Sheviis holiday. And the law for plowing around the individual trees is going to be very stringent. And what are we going to be talking about? We're going to be trying to define what is a field of trees. And that's what we're going to do. So the Mishnah starts and says, what is a field of trees? And it says, it is a field in which at least 3 trees are planted in a bet seah. So let's talk about this. A bet seah is the area where the seah of seeds would be sown, and it's 2,500 square amos. It's 50 by 50 amos, and this is this. By the way, there's a lot of relationship between the size of the bet seah and the temple courtyard, not accidental. And the Mishnah is trying to teach that if you have 3 trees that are distributed in this bet seah, the entire bet seah qualifies as a field of trees, and it could be plowed in the 6th year until Shavuot, because you're benefiting the fruit of this year. You're not doing work for preparation for the 7th year, which would be a problem. This is only for this year's work. And again, this was all repealed by the court of Rabban Gamliel a little bit later. Anyway, this is nonetheless what we're talking about, and it's good to know for other reasons that a field of trees is going to be 3 trees. So each of these trees, says the Rosh Hashanah, may be located anywhere within the bet seah, provided that the distance between them suffices to let a team of cattle and the plowing equipment pass through. Okay. Now, there's going to be a lot of difference on understanding on the significance of the bet seah. That's going to be coming up in part 2 of this shiur in the root system. And the Chazan Ish is looking at this a little bit differently. The Chazan Ish is saying that the trees in this bet seah have to be distributed in a way that the area they require for nourishment fills the entire bet seah. So what the idea is that the roots can go out to 25 amos, but they're not going to draw nourishment up until about 16 amos, about 16 and 2/3 amos. So they draw nourishment in a circle, and so basically one tree would have a diameter from one side to the other of 33 1/3 amos, because each root system going out would draw nourishment up to 16 2/3. And if you were looking at the whole length of a tree from this side to the other side, the diameter, not the radius would be 16 2/3, but the diameter would be 33 1/3. And the idea is that this would cover or maximize for 3 trees, where the trees would be not overlapping for this zone of nourishment. And if you were to put the trees closer, the nourishment would overlap, and then the total area of nourishment would be less than a bet seah. One questions, well, why do the roots can grow for a lot of trees like fig trees up to 25 amos, but they only draw nourishment up to 16 2/3. But nonetheless they do. So that, if you were plowing, and again, you have to have enough room to get the plowing equipment through there. Why are you plowing? We covered this in chapter 1. It's to try to get, right after the rains, to try to get the moisture into the soil to benefit the fruit, so that it doesn't dry out and get better quality fruit for this year. So we're going to continue on the Mishnah, and it's going to say that, so it's any field with at least 3 trees planted in a betseya, and the Mishnah is going to continue. It says, if these trees are fit to produce a block of pressed figs with a weight of 60 Italian manna. So then it says one may plow the entire betseya on their account. So what's going on here? So we've covered this in Masechet Peah a lot, and we looked at trees called Baishani. Baishani were shy trees that were trees that they should be ashamed because they don't produce a lot. And the idea is trying to find 3 normal producing fig trees, okay? And they're using the fig tree as a standard of measure for productivity. If you were using another kind of tree, let's say they were olive trees, the idea is that you would look at it and say, well, if they were fig trees, how much would it produce? And then you would say, okay, well, that's about the same volume as, for these olive trees. So that's the idea. Even if you have even if you have trees that don't bring fruit at all, and you're looking at like trees used for beams and lumber, which we covered in chapter 1, Halacha 1, you would still assess it in terms of the fig tree. And this comes up in Mishnah 3, by the way. So the idea is that we're looking at the size to determine what it would have produced if it were a fig tree. Okay. Then what happens is these dried figs are pressed together into cakes like loaves of bread. And when we're looking at 60 Italian manna, this comes up a lot because this is an Italian coin used in the Mishnaic time, and it's always, a standard because that was identical to the weight of the coin that was used in the days of Moshe Rabbeinu. So that's why it comes up, and you can find out more about that in Bavli Kiddushin 12a. But the idea is that you're looking at these trees. These are normal producing trees. Let's say they're fig trees because it makes it simple. But if they were olive trees, you would say, okay, it's going to produce about this same quantity. So how much does that come out to be? So 60 Italian manna, and the weight of a manna is 100 dinar, and a dinar is equivalent to 6 manna. And each of the manna comes out to 16 barley grains, so that the manna of this Mishnah would be 600 mea, or 9,600 barley grains. And so then you would multiply that out by 60. So that comes out to be 9,600 barley grains times 60. It's a pretty big amount of food that these 3 fig trees are producing. So what would happen if you are producing less with it? Well, that's going to come up because there's an issue with it, and then you're really not a field of trees anymore. And so like if you had 2 producing normally and 1 not producing normally, it's not a field of trees. And then if it's not a field of trees, you don't get this waiver of being able to plow it until Shavuot. And actually, it turns out that you have to treat it just like a field of grain, and so that you would plow it up until the last day of Pesach. And so this is only just a waiver just for normal producing trees, and that's the idea here. So the Gemara is going to continue. Is going to say one may plow the entire betseya on their account. So let's say we have this diameter of 16, this radius of 16 and a third amos. The diameter is, it's 16 and 2/3 radius and 33 and a third diameter. And it does not cover this zone for full nourishment as the Chazan Ish is holding out, that maximizes the nourishment of these trees in this radius and diameter for filling out the maximum of this betseya. So what happens is you're still going to plow the field because you've done the most you can, and it has the halachic status of a field of trees. So you can, even if you're plowing on an area that is outside of the zone of nourishment, but it still is within the field of the betseya, you're still allowed to plow it. That's what it's trying to say. It says one may plow the entire betseya on their account. That means that between the trees and also on the outermost part as well. And the Mishnah continues, says, but if they produced less than this amount, one may plow for them only the area occupied by the picker in his basket, which he holds outside himself. So this now saying, says Rosh Cirilio, that it's permitted to plow the area beneath the branches of the tree, plus a strip surrounding the tips of the branches where the picker would stand with his basket when picking the fruit. That would be a 2 amos strip, by the way. So why is this? This is saying that the tree failed to produce this required yield, and it no longer has the status of a field of trees. So once Pesach arrives, you can plow only their immediate vicinity, along with a strip that the gatherer can stand on with his basket. And the rest of the field is treated like a white field, which cannot be plowed at all after Pesach. So in the betseya, you're not allowed to plow outside of the branches, plus this 2 amos strip radius, where a person could stand there with his basket on the outside of the tree to do it. You have to plow underneath the tree and its branches, and you cannot plow the rest of the betseya. And you have to treat the betseya like a regular grain field. And after Shavuot, even any part of the vicinity of the tree would be forbidden to be plowed. But that's going to be after Shavuot, and that's going to be even underneath the branches of the tree after Shavuot, you can't plow it. Okay, so if there are fewer than 3 trees in the betseya, you also are only allowed to plow the immediate vicinity of the tree, and that's the idea. So even though each tree would draw nourishment from a third of a betseya, even that area, may not be plowed, and the reason is that only a field of trees would plowing be viewed as being done exclusively for the trees, as opposed to preparing the land for other vegetation or preparing it for something you're going to plant later for the 7th year. That's the idea. So this is what is going to be for how you're going to categorize a field of trees. It has to have at least 3 trees. That's the idea. So the Gemara is going to start off, and Rav Yudah says in the name of Shmuel, and Rabbi Abahu says in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, concerning one who purchased 3 trees in his fellow's property, if the trees are far apart from one another, but the gap between adjacent trees does not exceed the distance between trees where 10 are planted evenly in a betseya, or if the trees are close together but the gap between them is wide enough for a team of cattle to pass through with its plowing implements, then the buyer acquires the land beneath the trees and the land between them and the strip of land beyond the trees that is wide enough for the picker to stand with his basket. Okay, so let's start to unpack this. And the betseya, that's going to be 50 amos by 50 amos, or 2,500 amos, square amos. And if you have 10 trees that are distributed evenly on the betseya, each is going to have 250 amos, and the tree's area would be like a square, and the side of the square would measure 15.81 amos, and that's going to be the gap between the adjacent trees. Okay, before we were talking about a different measurement. So we covered this before when we were talking about nurseries for trees in Masechet Peah, and if you're going to plant them where you're having 2 strips of 5 in the betseya, this is how you can maximize all of the nutrition for all of the betseya. So if you're doing just 3 trees per betseya, you're going to have some area that's left that's not utilized by any of the trees. If you want to have where 100% of the betseya land is utilized for nutrition, it comes out to where you plant 10 trees, and it's 2 strips of 5. Okay, and each tree is going to be like a square, and the diameter, it's not going to diameter because it's a square. The length of each side is going to be 15.81. So then the distance from tree to tree will also be from 15.81, and a tree by itself, from the middle of a tree to the middle point between the next tree will be 15.81 because they're splitting it up into squares. So the idea is that if the trees are, so it was common for them to plant 10 evenly on the betseya because this is maximizing nutrition that the whole land would be utilized for nutrition. Now each tree may not get as much nutrition as if you planted 3 per betseya, but if you plant 3 per betseya, not all the land gets utilized for nutrition. That's the idea. So you have some unutilized part. This is maximizing the utilization of it, but each tree is not quite as well nourished as where you're doing 3. So the idea is that, let's say you're doing 10, and they want to know if you purchased these trees. Why do we care about purchasing trees, and why do we care about if the land underneath is going to be included in the sale or not? Well, this is Masechet Sheviis, and part of Masechet Sheviis is that the land returns back after the Yovel year. This is also going to be covered in here as the Yovel. So you are basically going to have a situation where you could be buying somebody's field of trees with the halachic status of the land underneath as well. And then that's going to be part of the calculation in the sale, because the land and the trees as well will come back to the person. So that's what they're trying to understand. You can't have a case where you're buying the tree, but you're not buying the land. There is an exception to that. We cover that in Masechet Peah. If you have a tree nursery, and the tree nursery is in the business of selling individual trees, then it is the custom that the person comes, digs up the tree, takes the tree with the ball of roots out. The dirt that is part of the ball of roots belongs to the buyer, but the land does not belong to the buyer. He has to take out the tree and the dirt and move it to his new location. But this is now talking about buying a field of trees. And so we know that all the fields revert back to the original owner at the Yovel year. And we know that since the trees are part of this field, they will revert as well. So you have to calculate that in your sale price. When you're selling that out, you have to say, okay, there's 7 years of productivity left. and here's what each tree can produce, and here's the value of what this field is worth, and I know that I have to give it back to you as the original owner, and here's what I'm willing to pay you, and they can decide to do it or not. So they're saying, okay, that if you have 10 that are planted evenly on the Bethsaida, and I explained why you would be doing 10 on a Bethsaida, and if the trees are close enough, but there's a gap, and there's a gap enough for a cattle team to pass through the plowing with plowing instruments. So basically, we're talking about a normal kind of field with equal spacing. We're not talking about where everything is clumped together. We're talking about 10 evenly spaced trees. That's what this is trying to describe. And it's something with functionality, so that, yes, a cattle team can pass through there with the plowing equipment and can evenly nourish the soil in a normal way. This is going to constitute a field of trees that's in a Bethsaida that maximizes the nutrition available within the ground itself. That's going to be 2 rows of 5 trees, and it has to be wide enough where the cattle team with the plowing equipment can go through. That's trying to describe a functional layout. And the idea is that if you've organized it with this functional layout, where this is basically a working field, this is a working field. You have real productivity. This is not, some retiree, planting some trees all together, clumped up together in his backyard. This is a functional farm. Okay, that's what this is trying to describe. It has functionality to it. And the idea is that once it has this requirement of the Bethsaida and the number of trees and the layout of the trees where there's the functionality where the cattle and the plowing equipment can pass between the trees, then if there is a sale, then the buyer acquires the land beneath the trees as well. That means that he gets the land beneath the branches and the land beneath the trunks of the trees. Also, the land between them. Also, a strip of land between the trees that's wide enough for the picker to stand with the basket. So the idea is that if you were buying even just the 3 trees on the Bethsaida, and they're spread out, far enough apart where they could still get, again, this functionality where the plow team can go through, that's also going to be a field of trees. The layout of 5 by 5 is also a field of trees. Both are doing 2 different things, but both qualify as a field of trees. The 5 by 5 is trying to maximize the maximum amount that you can get of where you're utilizing all of the land for nourishment, but the 3 trees are getting more nourishment, but part of the Bethsaida is not utilized for nourishment. That's the idea. So the idea is that if you have this qualification where the land is laid out like this, and the field of trees are laid out like this, and there's the functionality aspect, and there's room for a picker. In other words, it's a real working farm. That the land is sold with the trees. When you buy the trees, the land is sold by it. You have to calculate it out, and that's going to be included in the sale. It will come back to the original owner at the end of the Yovel year. Now, there's a dispute. Rav says the land is included in the sale only when the trees form a triangle, and Shmuel says the land is included even when the trees form a straight line. What is this talking about? This is only talking about the field of 3 trees. So this is only talking about where the 3 trees either form a straight line or it forms a triangle. Okay? So that's the dispute. There's no dispute on the 2 strips of 5 trees. No dispute on that. The dispute comes where, they're asking, if the bet seah is organized where the trees are going to be a triangle, where it's going to be 2 and 1, then Rav is saying that the land would be included in the sale only in this case. Shmuel says that this bet seah, that the land would be included for the whole bet seah, even the part that's not used for nutrition of the tree, even when the tree would form a straight line. You have 3 in a row. That's the idea. Shmuel is saying that the seller would sell the intervening land even where the trees stand in a line, and the land could then be used easily for plowing, and according to the view, then the trees would be arranged in a triangle. That land would certainly be sold. Okay, but in Rav's view, the buyer would acquire the land only where the trees are arranged in a triangle, only in a triangle, because in that case, it would be very hard to plow between the trees, and then the land there can't be used for some other crop. The worry is that you could use it for something else with this unutilized part, right? So it can be assumed that the seller intended to sell the land with the trees, but if the trees were planted in a straight line, the seller can easily plow between the trees and this unutilized part in the bet seah as well, and he could presumably intend to keep the land for himself, because you could presume that you could use it for some other crop. You could plant something else there next to it. That's the idea. So this argument is going to be found in Baba Batra, but Rav and Shmuel will be reversed in Baba Batra over there. But the idea is still the same of what they're worried about. They're worried that, again, Shmuel is holding that, where the land is in a straight line, it's easy to plow. And because of that, if you put it in a triangle, definitely the land would be sold. And Rav is holding that in here. The other idea is that, which Rav in the Yerushalmi is saying here, that in the triangle, it's hard to plow, and the land cannot be used for some other crop. And therefore, it can be assumed that the seller intended to sell the land with the trees. Okay. The Mishnah is relating to the previous discussion about selling the trees, as both deal with circumstances where 3 trees are legally inseparable from the land around them. All right, so the idea that the Vilna Goan is going to put out there is that the amount of land is going to be different in each context, and in the case of one who buys 3 trees, the issue is whether he acquires the land beneath the trees, between them, and immediately surrounding them. But in regards to Sheviis, the question is whether the entire bet seah is included, and nevertheless, the 2 cases may be related, as the Gemara is going to show, says the Vilna Goan. So the Gemara discusses this dispute between Rav, whether the trees must form a triangle, and Shmuel, which is that the trees may form a straight line, and that would apply to this mission as well. Rabbi Yossi says that the ruling of Rav, was stated there in regards to selling trees, and it was not stated here. So basically, this is what he's saying. He's saying that, according to the Mara Fulda, Rav's requirement that the trees must form a triangle in order to include the surrounding land does not apply to the matter of plowing before Sheviis. And regarding Sheviis, even if the trees stand in a straight line, Rav agrees that the entire field may be plowed. Now, there's going to be a dissenting view on this, and Rabbi Yonah says that the ruling of Rav, was stated even here regarding the laws of Sheviis in the case of trees that are close together. So, what Rabbi Yonah is trying to say is that if you have a bet seah and it has 3 trees that are close together, they have to form a triangle in order for plowing the bet seah to be permitted. So what's going on here? Maharal Fulda explains it like this. He says, if the trees are planted close together so that the distance between the adjacent trees is just the minimum needed to let the team of cattle and the plowing pass between them, we indeed require the trees to form a triangle. And only then does it constitute a field of trees, in which case one who plows even the entire Betsea presumably does so for their benefit. But if the trees are in a straight line, according to what Maharal Fulda is explaining, Rabbi Yonah is saying that what Rav is saying, okay, and they are close together, and they're in a straight line, they don't resemble a field of trees. That's what they're saying. And the preceding would apply only where the trees are planted at the minimum distance from one another. And again, what we're trying to do is we're trying to have rational working fields in Eretz Yisrael. All right, we're not talking about, just a husband and wife retiree who has a backyard, who's planting some things close together, and it's not really a working farm, right? It's just like a hobby. It's not really like an economic thing. You wouldn't plant it that way. Why? Because the roots are going to overlap, the nutrition zone's going to overlap, and it's not going to have the halachic status of a working field because you have such a large overlap of nutrition zones that it's never going to produce enough anyway. So in the Mishnah is saying that you have these three trees, and that here's the amount that it can produce. Now, if you're a husband and wife retiree in your backyard, and you're planting 3 fig trees really close together so that you could not pass a cattle plowing team between them, and the roots are interlinked, and the roots are less than 16 2/3 amos, from radius to radius, right? And basically you're not going to draw enough nourishment to get up to this yield for what's going to constitute a field. And so you'll be in the category of, you just won't be in it doesn't have the halachic status of a field of trees. It's, you have to treat it like any other field, like even a field of grain, where if you wanted to plow something and do some yard work on it, you can do it up to the end of Pesach. You don't get the waiver up to Shavuot because, again, you didn't make a field that is workable. The nutrition zones are going to overlap, and you're going to fall under this requirement of yield. So that's part of the issue here. And in this case, when you're taking the maximum size yield that you can, the zone, which is, the radius from the trunk of the tree to the outside part where the root starts to draw nourishment or stops to draw nourishment, which would be 16 2/3 amos, even though the roots will extend up to 25 amos, the area of nutrition stops at 16 2/3. That if you're going to try to put 3 onto a betsea, where you're trying to maximize that, okay, if you make it too close, it's not going to draw enough to get the yield, and so you just don't qualify because your yield isn't enough. So you're not we're talking about real workable farms. We're talking about real workable, rational things that can produce enough yield. It's not a bunch of people wasting their time drawing nourishment out of the soil in a flimsy sort of way that's not professional. Okay. So there's a difficulty that gets raised by Rabbi Manna with Rabbi Yonah's view. Rabbi Manna said to Rabbi Yonah, but if the trees are close to one another, can Rav's requirement apply? So, why, we have learned in the Mishnah over in Sheviis, Halacha 4, chapter 1, Halacha 4, where it's going to be saying that in order to permit plowing the entire Betsea, the minimum gap between the adjacent trees has to be enough for this team of cattle to pass through with the plowing tools. And the idea is that if the trees are more densely concentrated, it's going to be assumed that they will be transplanted, or it was done wrong and it fails to constitute a field of trees. You might plant them kind of close together in a nursery situation where they're young saplings, and then you're going to move them to another part. But nonetheless, that would not count as a field of trees. And the Gemara is going to continue. It's going to say, in order to permit plowing the entire Betseya, because again, if you're putting down 3 trees, not all of the Betseya is utilized for nutrition. That's why you would have that other layout of 2 strips of 5. So, in order to permit the entire Betseya, the minimum gap between the adjacent trees must be enough for a team of cattle to pass through with its plowing implements. And the Mishnah does not distinguish between trees that are in a straight line or form a triangle. The idea that Rabbi Matta is asking is he's saying that the only distinction is that it draws that if the cattle and the plow can pass between the trees, then one may plow the entire Betseya. But if the cattle and their implements cannot pass, one may not plow the entire Betseya. And so, in either case, there's no basis for Rav to require it to form a triangle. That's the idea that he's bringing up. So, with respect to the matter of purchasing 3 trees, the Gemara gives 2 issues. First, Rabbi Yochanan is teaching that the land is acquired together with the trees only if the gap between the adjacent trees is neither too large nor too small. And the second requirement is that you have with Rav and Shmuel, and the disagreement that they have, whether the trees have to form a straight line or a triangle. And the comparison between the purchasing of the trees and the plowing for Sheviis, the Gemara is dealing only with this second issue. It's not discussing whether the minimum and maximum gaps applicable are going to be in regard to buying the trees, are also going to be plowing before Sheviis. So regarding the minimum gap for Sheviis, there is no room to debate, because in Mishnah 4, it states very clearly that the gap between the trees has to be wide enough for cattle and the plowing implements, tools, to come through it. And that if the gap is too narrow, then it does not count as a field of trees. And so you would not be allowed to plow the rest of the Betseya. If you wanted to do some plowing, you would be limited up to the end of Pesach, and you could only do it under the branches. That's plus a little tiny 2 amos strip just on the outside of it, that a person could stand there with a basket and pick the outside fruit. That's the idea. So we're dealing with this gap between the adjacent trees that have to be wide enough for a team of cattle to pass through with the tools, with the plowing tools. And the Gemara is going to wonder about the reason for this requirement. And the Gemara says, come, consider the following problem. Does it make sense to say that when a team of cattle with its plowing implements can pass between the trees, the roots of the trees extend to the sides, thus providing a reason to permit plowing the entire field? But when the team of cattle with the plowing tools cannot pass through, the roots do not extend to the side, and the entire field cannot be plowed. So the length of the roots are the same regardless of the distance between the trees. So why would you worry about that? That's the idea. So the Gemara's question is based on the assumption that a distance of 4 amos between trees is required, because if the trees are closer, then their roots will not spread out, and the field cannot be regarded as a field of trees. And sometimes the Yerushalmi will raise a question and leave it unresolved, and even if there's answers that are really available, it will still do this sometimes. And perhaps, with a lot of hard work, they leave it there, for the student to work on it and find the solution on their own. So the Gemara is correct in arguing that the roots of the tree would extend the same distance regardless of the distance between it and the next tree, but the Mishnah is requiring a gap before Amos to let the cattle and the plowing tools pass. Otherwise, it's going to be too difficult to plow it, and then the owner would have to uproot at least one of them. That's or he just didn't cultivate it properly, and he'll use it for firewood. That's another possibility. So even if you're just using it for firewood and you didn't, you're not clearly using it for an economic reason for fruit. You're using it to make fire. It's not a field, and it's just not a field of trees. And then you have to treat it like a field of grain, which would be a white field, and it means that you can plow it, only until Pesach. So that's the idea. So we're going to get into root systems tomorrow, and we're going to cover that because, it's really important for trying to understand how, the nourishment works for the field. That's why this is organized out like this, and this is to try to maximize to get the right yield to come up with, what is going to be a field of trees. Otherwise, you're going to fall below that threshold, and it's not really going to be a working farm. Have a great day.